Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. My name is John Donnelly. I am the chairman of the Press Freedom team here at the Press Club. The Press Freedom team leads the club's efforts to promote, obviously, press freedom and transparency, and to fight back where we see it is challenged in the United States and around the world. And one of the places that we are especially concerned about, and that makes the focus of today's event, is the situation in Latin America for journalists. We are extremely concerned about events throughout the region, especially in the countries that we are going to focus on here today. And let me be clear, the National Press Club calls for the release from jail of any journalists who are being held right now. Journalism is not a crime. To talk about this issue, today we have a distinguished panel, and to moderate that panel, we have Dagmar Thiel, who is CEO of Fundamedios, which is an organization that promotes press freedom and transparency in Central America, in South America, and in the United States. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dagmar.
Thank you, John. Good morning to everybody who is joining us here today in person. This is a hybrid event. We are also live on Facebook of Voces del Sur and on Fundamedios. You can follow us all around the world, and we would like everybody to raise their voice to demand freedom for journalists. In this demand, Fundamedios and Voces del Sur, which is a network of 13 organizations, human rights organizations that defend freedom of the press in Latin America, and that monitor freedom of the press, we were joined by very important organizations that also demand freedom for journalists. Those are Race and Equality, the Inter-American Press Association, the Inter-American Dialogue, Pan-American Development Fund, IFEX, PEN America, PEN International, AMARC, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Our organizations are deeply concerned about the precarious and unsafe environment in which media workers in the Americas do their job. Journalists are subjected to killings, kidnappings, arbitrary detentions, exile, imprisonment, and judicial harassment while facing online threats and attacks. In the last 20 months, at least 27 journalists were killed across Mexico, Honduras, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Venezuela. These assassinations cannot be unpunished. They need to be investigated, and we need to have a consequence for these killings. But in addition, and we will refer to this, we will call to the arbitrary arrests of 5 journalists and 1 newspaper general manager in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. We're deeply concerned about what's happening in those countries, and we will call for the solidarity of journalists all around the world to ask for their freedom. So today at the National Press Club, we will have a panel of journalists and scholars of these countries to talk about what's happening there. I won't go deeper to talk about who is here on our panel. You may look at them. You've got our QR to see all the information that we have regarding what's happening to the journalists and to our panelists. But I am joined here on this table by Tiffany Roberts from Univision. She's a Nicaraguan journalist from Univision. Anibal Toruño, who is founder of Radio Darío in Nicaragua. I do have Mely, Reyes, and Carlos Roa from Venezuela. Mely from Efecto Cocuyo, and Carlos Roa from APEVEX. And I'm also here with Armando Chaguaceda, who is a scholar and a writer for Havana Times from Cuba. We are also honored, deeply honored, with the presence of Pedro Vaca, who is the Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression. Thank you, Pedro, for joining us here this morning. And we will go straight to the questions. We will try to keep the questions or the answers short so people can make questions. You can make them here in present or also online. We will have Lizzie and Claudia from PADF. I'm grateful for all your help giving me the questions so I can do them once we have the online questions. And here in present, you will have the microphone later. But we will start with Tiffany Roberts. Please We do have here the pictures from Miguel Mendoza and Juan Holleman, who are detained in Nicaragua. What can you tell us about those journalists detained in Nicaragua and everything that's happening there?
Yeah, so basically, we've heard Nicaragua and Ortega has been in the news for the past few years, and we've always seen Nicaragua from here in the US as sort of like a vegetarian version of like Cuba and Venezuela. But that's everything. Everything in Nicaragua has changed since 2018, when there was all this social unrest. And from then on, the government changed its tactics dramatically. And basically, they went after any voices of dissent. And at the top of the ladder was the Foundation Chamorro, which former Violeta Chamorro, that was her legacy. When she left office, she left this foundation because she comes from a media family, and it was the Chamorro Foundation. And basically, the purpose of that foundation was to strengthen media, or to strengthen democracy through one of the main pillars, which is media. So the foundation was like the godmother of all the independent media that were having trouble surviving economically in the government, in the government of Ortega. But what happened after 2018, that they became a lot more blunt in their persecution. And then in June of this year, the daughter of Violeta, which was the president of the foundation, literally, she was arrested, and the foundation was accused of money laundering just because they channel most of their aid from USAID. And every single journalist in Nicaragua that is not aligned with the government has been cited by the prosecutor's office as a witness or in part of the investigation against the Chamorro Foundation. So the exodus of journalists in Nicaragua is incredible. And soon you will hear Anibal to my right here, who's a media owner, talk about how they are being targeted, like specifically targeted. Every journalist that remains in Nicaragua basically has an exit plan. Everybody knows in Nicaragua that they're going after you. And it's just a matter of when, not if, is when. So everybody is looking where to go, whether to go to Costa Rica, whether to go to Honduras. They're staying in Nicaragua as long as they can. But doing journalism in Nicaragua is becoming increasingly difficult, because they are, and I'm not talking, that they see you working on the streets and that they'll harass you. No, they put cops outside the door of your parents' home. They chase your wife. They chase your kids when they go to school. I mean, it's become very unlivable, because once they go after your family, it's when you're, as a journalist, you're most vulnerable. You can take it, in doing your work, but once your family's in play, then it's a lot more difficult. I hate to make personal examples, but my family lives in Nicaragua. I'm not here, I happen to work for Univision, but I'm a Nicaraguan journalist, right? And I always been covering Nicaragua. I was there in June. I crossed through the land from Honduras. I drove into Nicaragua through the border. The next day, there were 2 pickup trucks with 20 cops armed with AKs stationed outside my mother's house. So go figure. I wasn't staying at my mother's house. I was working, so I was at the hotel, but that's how they work. So what do you do? So my mom texts me, she goes, because I hadn't even told her. I said, you're here? I go, yeah. I go, how do you know? Because there's, cops outside. That's how I know. So that's how they work. So Anibal has a radio station, one of the few left in the country. So everybody's, the local journalists, they're all practicing self-censorship. They got to be careful what they say, when they say. You can't talk about COVID. You can't talk about the laws being passed. You end up talking about the weather, about traffic and about, crime. But covering politics and denouncing corruption is a big no-no. So then what happened? Poor Miguel, he's a sportscaster. Now, all the real media, when I say real, I mean, the news hounds, they knew exactly what they were up against. And many of them fled the countries, other ones went into hiding. There's no more bylines when you write a story in Nicaragua, because nobody knows where you are. But Miguel was all sportscaster, and he got caught because he said, why? They're not going to come after me. I'm just a sportscaster. But he did enough noise in social media. He was a firecracker on social media. He got a lot of following. They arrested him. And when they arrested him, it happened like kidnapping. That's why everybody says he's missing. Nobody's seen him. And the only reason we know he was arrested was the police put out a press release saying he was arrested. And then, of course, they went after La Prensa, which is the oldest newspaper. If you've ever been to Nicaragua, you know what La Prensa is. And they went in, they shut it down, and Juan Lorenzo, who's not even a journalist, but his family owns the paper, he happens to be the director of the time, so he's arrested too, sitting in jail, accused of whatever trumped up charges they have. So there's a little picture there with everybody there, of everybody that's been arrested since June. That's just since June, including there, of course, Cristiana, you know, Chamorro, the head of the foundation, her driver is arrested. He's been in jail for almost 2 months now. So the arbitrarity of what's happening is scary. If you're considering and covering the elections in Nicaragua, they're not going to let you in. New York Times, Washington Post, they've tried. They're not letting him in because there's no U.S. airlines going in, so you have to go through local airlines, and they vet you, and they don't let you on the plane. So it's really no end in sight. So that's as far as I can do with 5 minutes.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Tiffany. Well, that was a very strong start. Anibal, you have been persecuted. You are in exile. Your radio station was burned. What can you tell us about doing independent journalism in Nicaragua?
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. The information blackout created and imposed by Daniel Ortega is a result of his constant attacks to the independent media and journalists. His strategy is revealed at several levels: destruction and confiscation of newsroom, search and seizure of building equipment, persecution of journalists and their families. In more than one occasion, they foreclosure on more than one media outlet with the arrest of the reporters and the news director. What happened in Venezuela over the span of 10 years, it has taken less than 3 years in Nicaragua. Since Ortega took office in 2007, more than 23 media outlets had closed, either by economic pressure or shut down with a court order. More than 18 talk shows with independent content has been canceled, and about 150 journalists are in exile, 34 of them just in the last few weeks. This is the worst it has ever been in the history of Nicaragua. Since April 2018, it had seen 50% of our reporters flee the country with their life threatened. The only surviving newspaper, La Prensa, was the latest victim. The oldest and most important media outlet in the country was taken over by the police force, and the director still sit in jail and accused on fabricated criminal charges. The police of Nicaragua has grown exponentially in the past couple years using aggressive recruiting tactics. The National Police now have 20,000 men and women dedicated to selective persecution of voices of dissidents. This number surpassed the number of soldiers in the Army of Nicaragua, Panama, and Honduras. This oversized police force is being used to target journalists' homes and their families. Dozens of cops stake out our newsroom, our homes, our parents' homes, our wife, our children, and follow and harass. Media employees are constantly in the eyes of the police for any infraction. Roadblocks are frequently checked. Ortega turned into the country into the big jail in Nicaragua. Being a journalist became a sentence. Sentence of death, jail, or exile. But the moment of the document, the safe and the surrounding fall of the enemy of the democracy and freedom of the expression is gonna come. Ortega has played the nail in the coffin with a combo of law approved recently by the Sandinista Congress. The legislation is designed to sanction media that is conspiracy against the integrity of Nicaragua, people with heavy penalty. For example, the new Halo carries a sentence of life in prison. To this day, we can count less than 10 media outlets inside the country, and their future is uncertain. They are under constant pressure by the regime persecuted to shut down or jail. The few media owners left standing are living under cloud of threat. The response has been to self-censor their media coverage in order to survive. Nicaragua is a prison, kidnapped by Daniel Ortega and his wife. Thousands are fleeing through the borders, more than 100,000 refugees in Costa Rica and other countries. This is the quiet exodus we have seen due to the brutal attack against journalists, extending to family members, wife, children, brother, and sister, including the expropriation of home. We are in constant fear of what we can happen to our family, but we also know we cannot let the fear overtake us or to let it spread, because dictatorship like Ortega, not the fear, is the key to submission and slavery. We choose freedom. Let's take the opportunity to ask ourselves, where are they? We demand their freedom and proof of life for those that have been illegally taken, kidnapped by totalitarian governments.
Thank you, Anibal. I will pass now the word to Armando Chaguaceda. Cuba saw an uproar in recent weeks. There were many people on the street demanding civil liberties, but there were many citizens arrested, among them journalists. What's their situation? What's going on in Cuba now?
Thank you, Dagmar. Thank you, everybody. I have a few minutes, but I'm going to talk a few things about the general situation, but also the case of our colleagues and the scenario that we could see in the future. First, we can understand that, like Dagmar said, that we have living in the last years a mixture of things. A mixture of the COVID impact, the pandemic impact, new change in the constitution, and new change in political environment, more autocratic politics, but at the same time, an uprising, an improvement of the civic engagement and civic actions in Cuba. The mixture of all this situation, of the impact of the bad management of the economic and the pandemic, and the impact of U.S. sanctions in the economy, all that is the frame to understand what happened with the journalists and what happened with the civil society. Especially in the case that we are talking right now today, Esteban Rodriguez, Lázaro Yuri, and Joandi, we have three very important cases of imprisonment of journalists. Esteban, for example, is a journalist of ADN Cuba, is one of the independent outlets based in Miami, but with some journalists in Cuba. But at the same time, he was arrested in Cuba in April 30 of the last year because he has been protesting, not only covering like journalists, but protesting with civil rights activists in one of the most important streets of Cuba, of Havana, Obispo Street. At the same time, he's suffering of COVID at least twice on jail. We have reported twice on jail. He's suffering several crises of COVID, Esteban, and he's very important because he's one of the young people from worker origin, from poor origin, that is trying to make new journalists, civic citizen, new journalists, but at the same time, he's a human rights activist. It's very important, the case of Esteban. But also the case of Joandi Montiel. Joandi Montiel, the people in Cuba know like El Gato, is an influencer, and make some, in media, in Facebook, in Twitter, that have been increasing in Cuba, make some short histories about the Cuban life, anyway, and have been imprisoned, like was imprisoned Lázaro Yuri Valle, using the figure of desacato, is disrespect in English. You shouldn't disrespect the the government, the people of the state, anyway, and you could go to jail from the point of view of the state for this reason. But we don't only have these 3 colleagues on jail. We are suffering a general crackdown of independent media. We have, for example, several colleagues, women, most of them, Camila Cosa, that was on jail too, Luz Escobar, that is a prisoner at home. It's not formally legally prisoner, but it has the police outside the house, impede to go to the street. And Maricarla Ares, that was on jail. We have a general situation of crackdown of a new press, a new citizen press that have been born with young people living inside the system, growing inside the system, and don't know no more than this system. I'd like to finish with 3 short ideas that for me are very important. First, Cuba is the most closed environment for information and journalists in America. It's legally closed space. We don't have the right to have independent exercise of journalism. Is the first issue. The second issue is that the new constitution that was approved in 2019 recognized without bias the exercise of freedom of speech and of freedom of expression. But a lot of decrees and other laws control this freedom of speech. We have a contradiction even in the term of the official legal frame of Cuba. But the last idea is that I think that we shouldn't understand this situation in Cuba, but also in Venezuela and Nicaragua from an ideological point of view. It is not a struggle between left and right. It's not ideological struggle. It's a political struggle between autocracy and democracy. And if we understand this point of view, we can make solidarity with all the journalists, independent of their ideology, independent of the government that is repress them, because journalism is a professional activity and is a right to the societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Armando. And yes, journalism is not a crime, and we need to be solidar with them. Carlos, it seems that the Nicaragua government has surpassed Cuba and Venezuela, which is going on with repression against the press for over 20 years. What's happening right now there with the few independent journalists? And I invite you to take your mask down so people can understand.
Yeah, thank you, Dagmar. Yes, since the Venezuelan regime has lasted 21 years to this day, it's a very complex situation. But as I told you, all my fellows in this table, in this set today, it's the same playbook. The resemblances are scary, absolutely scary. So I would like to start stressing that Nicolas Maduro's regime has undertaken the systematic dismantling of the freedom of press in Venezuela as part of his efforts to deepen his dictatorial rule. This includes the prosecution of journalists taking advantage of a submissive justice system tailored specifically for this. At the moment, there are 13 journalists imprisoned or under probation in our country. And please let me mention, to set an example, just 4 of them. Let's start with Roland Carreño, who is at the extreme right for you of these photos. He has just completed 10 months in prison on Thursday, August 26th. Carreño is charged with the alleged crimes of conspiracy, criminal association, financing terrorism, and possession of weapons of war. A court admitted the charges during hearing on July 9th. Carreño has diabetes, suffers from blood pressure, prostate, and labyrinthitis, and he has been denied of medical attention. So far, the court hearing his case denied all the precautionary measures requested by his defense, including house arrest. Eduardo Galindo, our second case to be mentioned today, On April 15, 2020, a group of agents of Venezuelan National Guard arrested him to be interrogated regarding a report published by Senderos de Apure, the news website he edits. Galindo's detention was related to his reporting on fuel shortages in the region. He is on probation under a filing regime every 15 days. He has had a trial open for a year, accused of allegedly publishing false information and resisting authority. Third case, Luis Carlos Diaz, a journalist and activist well known throughout Venezuela and the global human rights community. Maduro's second-in-command, Diosdado Cabello, falsely accused Diaz of participating in a right-wing conspiracy to cause the current electrical outages across the country in 2020. Diaz was charged with instigating crimes and released on the condition that he would report to intelligence officials every week. He is also prohibited from leaving the country or speaking publicly about his detention. Jesus Medina, a photojournalist that was arrested in 2017 with journalists from Switzerland when they were doing a report on a prison in Venezuela. He was imprisoned again in 2018 for a report on the hospital crisis in the country. They released him in 2020 with precautionary measures, regime of presentation to the authorities, and prohibition of leaving Caracas. He cannot speak about his case. He was charged with alleged finance crimes and incitement to hatred. We want to highlight here today that the U.S. government has imposed sanctions against those who have led Venezuela to an economic downfall, causing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis by incurring in serious acts of corruption. That is why we are advocating in favor of including in the U.S. sanctions imposed on the regime those officials and institutions that, throughout their actions and decisions, are silencing the news media outlets, thus violating the right of Venezuelans to be informed. This petition was elevated to Madam House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, among other relevant personalities, and we will continue advocating on this. Finally, we join our voice to claim the total and unconditional freedom of all the prosecuted and imprisoned journalists in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Journalism is not a crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos Roa from APEVEX, the Association of Journalists, Venezuelan Journalists Abroad. And we will go on with our testimonies with Luz Mely Reyes from Efecto Cocuyo. She's the founder of Efecto Cocuyo. How can journalists go on informing in Venezuela? How can they still shine light on what's happening? And you are doing this from here. How is your team working? How is it being an independent journalist in Venezuela? Luz Mely.
I'm going to take my mask off. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here, to my fellows for the speech. Well, I would like to share a short story in order to show how the pattern of persecution, harassment, and arbitrary detention affect not only the democracy, but the journalists itself, the practicing of journalism in Venezuela. In 2019, in September, began a new cycle of protests in Venezuela and a small city in Venezuela. It was a group of 4 journalists covering the situation. And when they were talking with the people who was protesting because the lack of water, the lack of electricity of that situation in that small city, they were attacked by the police. The police attacked them with pepper gas, and then they had to run and look for shelter. And when they were in that shelter, the police come to that house and throw a gas tear bomb against them. In August, this is the second story, in August 2020, a group of journalists received an alert about an investigation against them admitted by the prosecutor office. At that time, the courts were closed, only respond to serious cases like such as homicide. This group of journalists were working in some investigation about corruption and the official corruption in Venezuela. As consequences, several of these journalists have to leave their homes looking for shelter, and some of them have to leave the country. The question, are you safe, usually comes out every time a media outlet or journalist is targeted by an official, and there is not exceptional cases. The organization APEVEX has identified a pattern of arbitrary detentions, restriction of access to public information. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has identified a pattern of intimidation and public defamation up to and including prosecution, as my fellow explained. In my case, I had been the target of these patterns, which had led me to leave the country on several occasions due to well-founded threats against my integrity, my family integrity, and the team which I am a member. Intimidation, arbitrary detention, and physical aggression were the most common types of violations suffered by journalists in Venezuela. The Instituto Prensa y Sociedad document between 2019 and 2091 a total of 481 cases of restriction and aggression against journalists work throughout the national territory. The organization has systematized this information in a risk map called Bitácora de Riesgo that you can find on the internet, in which 70 types of violence are listed, of which the most recurrent are intimidation, arbitrary detentions, and physical aggression, as I showed in the story that I shared with you. They made a study that the study shows the main effect generated by intimidation, which is censorship. And this is followed by media censorship as a reaction to the threats. When some journalists say that they have to displacement from the country or inside of the country or out of the country, several journalists report cases that they, after receiving intimidating message, they have to cease their professional practice for a period of time during fearing that their personal integrity will be affected. They have to go to look for shelter also. Some of them resume their work with the decision to deal with less critical or controversial issues for the authorities. I say that doing journalism is that there were a pandemic of censorship and self-censorship. And I would like to ask you if you remember what it was like when the pandemic confinement was declared in every country. Think about being in your house without electricity, water, and internet, not one day, but many days. It's like a Venezuelan journalist work already. Or when your friends calling or asking you, are you safe? Or if you have to leave your home with a suitcase and cross a border full of armed people, not knowing when you will return home, or when you have to stay abroad waiting for the situation to cool down and for your persecutor to forget about you because he is after another prey. In short, practicing journalism in Venezuela can lead you to prison, to exile, to the doctor for physical injuries, and even to psychologists for mental health issues as a result of the harassment. The stories I mentioned at the beginning have no end. This year, digital media was closed. Most of the independent media are constantly blocked on the internet. There are barely 10 print newspapers, and there are a lot of places that they don't have any media to receive information. But I don't want to finish the conversation without remembering that it's necessary to say that many journalists remain in the field. There are alliances with journalists in the field, and journalists that we have to live outside the country. And they are doing the best journalism possible under the circumstances already described. I think that for them, It is necessary that many voices and actions are raised to prevent that more Venezuelan journalists from living situations of harassment, threat against their integrity, and to prevent them from abandoning the profession. As we are saying here, doing journalism is not a crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luz Mely. This is the situation we're facing in Latin America in 3 countries, and they are authoritarian countries. Authoritarianism is growing. Pedro Vaca, Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. What can we do to stop this?
Dagmar, thank you. And I would like to thank you all for coming, especially to Anibal, Tiffany, Armando, Carlos, Luz Mely. And also, I would like to thank to all the civil society organizations that made this possible. I think this reflection is very relevant for our moment in this specific context. We have to raise the voice for an urgent call for freedom that it's in risk in most of our countries. Authoritarianism is back, and in some countries is consolidated, as you could hear from people that knows in deep what is happening in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And if we have, sadly and dramatically, detained journalists in this hemisphere, it's because a lot of factors, but I would like to highlight 2 of those. The absence of rule of law and the institutional capture of all the powers. And also that political leaders do not believe in pluralism and democratic values. Those 2 concepts, I think, are part of the seeds that bring us to this very worried situation. In democracy, controversy and debate is welcome, but censorship is against freedom of expression standards and also affects the right of every single woman, every single man, of being well informed about what is happening in their specific context. Also, we have the rise of discourses, of speeches that stigmatize journalists, that denigrate about the job that they do, and that it's something that has consequences on the daily life of free flow of information. Getting in deep to the cases we have shared today, I also would like to thank the speakers that are here with us, because they also are facing the censorship. It's not only, these are not stories about others, it's a story of societies that are fighting for freedom. But also with the journalists that are detained in prison, in jail, we are very worried about the due process. We are very worried about how the judiciary could be captured and how the independence of these trials is compromised. Several reports from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and from the Special Rapporteur Office that I lead have put a significant label of the pattern of no institutional respect in these countries to press freedom. And it is not only the specific cases of journalists in jail, it is also a whole context that wants to impose silence, fear, and finally self-censorship as the rule, as the new status quo. And that is not democratic, that is not pluralism. I would like to wrap up with a couple of ideas. The first one is that I think that the hemisphere has the democratic duty of being aware of the consequences that these 3 examples could have in the region, and also the potential of replication to other countries. Unfortunately, authoritarianism is back, but also could be inspiring for others. And we know really in this sad way, in a very worried way, the consequences of this. We have studied and we have documented, well, these three countries, and I can say to you that these are not isolated facts. I would say that these are links of a big chain of censorship, and it could be understood in some specific scenarios as a state policy of silence. I would say that is a sophisticated mechanism that if needs a law, it's going to approve and publish and implement. If needs the prosecutor office, is going to use it. If needs the police, is going to put police in the houses of journalists. All the institutional frame is not in favor of human rights and freedom of expression, is in favor of protecting these authoritarian behaviors. And I think that this is something that we have to worry about. Nowadays, there are not warranties for press freedom in these three countries. And I encourage the international community to protect, to denounce, and to stand up with journalism in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
Thank you, Pedro Vaca, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. So this is the situation. We're open for questions here in the room, or if you want to make questions also online, we will read them loud here. So Lizzie can help us with the microphone. Who wants to do questions?
I'm happy to start. Does anyone have a suggestion as to what the United States government in particular can do or should do to make this situation better?
Yes,
Carlos?
I have a partial answer for that. As I stated in my declaration, I am here on behalf of Venezuelan Journalists Abroad, APEVEX Association, okay? The U.S. government has implemented sanctions against the Venezuelan government, economic sanctions, because of the political failure of the system, which we are suffering, we the Venezuelans are suffering. But we are committed to highlight everywhere. That's why we appreciate so much this opportunity that APEVEX, our Association of Venezuelan Journalists Abroad, is working in a campaign to stress these sanctions to the persons in the government that are cutting the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of expression. I mean, there is a very clear and a specific harassment of the free press in Venezuela. So the sanctions have to stress this, have to stress that one of the crimes in Venezuela is cutting the freedom of expression, is killing journalists, is imprisoning journalists, is using a tailored justice system to prosecute the journalists. So that's what we are asking, specifically APEVEX. Maybe our...
Maybe other questions?
I just, on a personal level, I'm not an activist nor an advocate, nor I'm here as a journalist to talk about my colleagues. I just think my job as a journalist is to be here and to do awareness, to let you all know what's going on. And if you want to help us, then help us. And let's make, I'm going to quote I told my mom I was here with Anibal, and my mom's sitting in Nicaragua. She grew up here. She went to school here on the second floor of this building. And she says, now you too tell America how important it is to help out all the journalists in Nicaragua, as well as the rest of persecuted journalists throughout the world. You're the only ones that ring out the truths be known. As in Afghanistan, how else would we have all known the truth if it wasn't for the reports from the ones inside the scenes? So, that's all really what we can do is just scream out loud as we can to let everybody know what's happening. and for you to help us with colleagues and let's just, let's spread the word. That's what I can say.
I think it's not how much can the United States do for us, it's how much we can do for us. Countries in Latin America have much responsibility for what's going on in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And I think they have to be honest instead of to look to the other side and confront the situation that we have. And I believe the journalists in Nicaragua are taking and is doing so much. But I think the failure is coming from our countries, Latin America, from Mexico, from Chile, from Argentina, from Bolivia, everywhere. And they're afraid and not confronting what's going on. I think the United States is doing so much. And like John F. Kennedy said, it's not how much United States can do for us, as how much the Latin American people can do for us.
Can we go with another question, maybe?
Hi, I'm Glenn Marcus with the Press Freedom Team here at the Press Club. Just a quick question. Is there a church press that's active or church publications that have any involvement in this press freedom issue?
In Nicaragua, the church is very active. They have a radio station, they have a cable station, but they're also being subject of repression. They're keeping a low profile, very self-censoring, staying along the lines of their spiritual. Right now with the pandemic, that's taken up their priority and trying to keep the people outside churches and using their network to spread their message, but not so much involved in this theme that we're talking about here.
Armando?
Yes, in Cuba, well, in Cuba Cuba is very different because it's a very closed system, but even in Cuba, the church has been very important in several points in these times. First, sustain an open channel with the government to release press, for example, but at the same time, supporting to the people that are defending to the people in jail, going to the police station, for example. So some priests have become vocal, trying to open a dialogue with the government in the sense, in the church act, more quiet, more smart, more in Lord 10, but yes, have become, at least in Cuba, more active in the near times, recent times.
Any question from Venezuela about media that is related to church?
Okay. I'm gonna try to explain. I don't know. I'm not sure if I understand the question.
It's if there are media organizations related to the church,
Oh,
si es que hay
perfect. Yeah.
medios que tienen relación con las iglesias y
Perfect.
que estén involucrados.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so for example, in Venezuela, there is a very well-known radio station, which is called Fe y Alegría. They are covering all the country. They are linked to the Jesuits, the Catholic Church, and they covering the communities. They are also suffering the attack for the government because they say they are, I don't know, conspiration against the government. But they are working under pressure.
Another question we've got there on the back. She's censoring you.
I'm not a journalist. I'm Santiago Canton with Inter-American Dialogue. I want to push a bit further some of the questions made before, which is what can we do? And the reason I want to push it further is because of the last 20 years we've been trying. When the Office of the Special Rapporteur started back in 1998, Latin America was the region of the world with more journalists killed. And in between 1998 and now, we haven't progressed. I mean, if you look at the situation of journalists right now in Latin America in general, not only in these three countries, you can find that the situation is, whether it's Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, or Mexico, or El Salvador, the situation is not good at all. So what else can we do from the international community? I mean, we have failed to some extent. So we have granted precautionary measures. We have denounced it every time we could. We've had cases in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and we've done as much as we thought we could, and the situation has not improved. And we have to take a little bit of the blame for that. So what else?
Armando, would you like to take that question?
Yes,
first?
it's very important. The first issue that I think that we should accept that the situation has changed. We are going to have the birthday, the 20th birthday of the Carta Interamericana, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. First, we should accept that Latin America is not enough, is no more a democratic region with a democratic consensus from the academic point of view, but also from the government and civil society, an epistemic change in our mind. We are facing another situation. Second, improving the solidarity more in civic society. For example, yes, the government made some statement in international organization, but for example, we have a problem in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua with some of our allies and friends of civil society in Latin America in ideological biases. They think that the struggle is ideological, and it's not ideological, it's political. It's autocracy against democracy. If we sustain the idea that we are on the time of the Cold War, and we are facing a struggle between the Jewish imperialists against the national liberal movement, we can't understand nothing. Then I think that is a growth of challenge, even from the academic world, from the civil society, and accept that we are in a global illiberal wave, from Russia, from Turkey, from several countries. And the liberal wave in Latin America is facing two main characteristics. The liberal wave that is more coordinated is from the far left government regimes. And at the same time, we have far right populist, not authoritarian, but populist governments. We should accept that we are in a very complex environment and try to articulate the solidarity from this point of view.
Thank you. Mely?
Okay, thank you, Santiago, because that question allowed me to repeat some solicitude, I think so is the word, that we had made not as activists, because we are just, we only want to have the right environment to do our job, that is journalism. So we want to feel free and secure. So I think there is a practical decision that the international group can make. For example, I think that we have to elevate the cost from the people who is attacking the freedom of speech. They have to know that there is no easy to attack a journalist and let it go. I think that it's important to have to be aware about that. Another petition that I think we can work is about how to create some spaces sure for journalists. I want to say that, for example, when a journalist have to leave the country or have to move, they feel alone because they're nobody. Okay, there are some people who help them, but they feel alone because he have to deal with the family, he have to deal with a lot of things. So I think it is time that we be aware about how we can do to help the people. They are suffering that kind of situation. It's not, I think that there is a space to work. The third thing that I was asking some years ago is why don't work creating some kind of humanitarian visas for journalists. Sometimes when the journalists have to leave the country, they don't have any place to go because they have to ask for a visa, and coming to here, or you know that is difficult. And I know, for example, there are Venezuelan journalists, I guess there are other journalists from other countries that are waiting for asylum for more than 5 years here, for example. And that is the situation in all the countries. So I think there are some 3 or 4 actions that we can do. Thank you.
We'll take the last question from here. The last 2 questions, okay? And then I think we stop.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chloe Zoller, and I work at the Pan American Development Foundation here representing Voces del Sur, our network. Dagmar, Fundamedios, everyone. So I hear a theme, Tiffany, you brought this up a couple of times, but I hear it from everyone on the panel, which is the need to visibilize the issues that are facing journalists and to make people aware of what's going on. And we've talked a lot about concrete examples of detention, especially arbitrary detention and lack of due process. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit too about other types of threats that journalists are facing or other forms of repression that we're seeing that are before those extremes, that are causing, a lot of these issues. And in particular, how that might affect marginalized groups or members of organizations that are not receiving the same level of attention. Rural groups, I'm not sure, whatever you're experiencing, but what type of crimes and repression against journalists are less visible but equally as troubling, and that if they continue unabated might lead to these type of extremes that we're seeing in the cases of the victims we've discussed today? And that's for anyone who might want to answer it.
Okay, I'll jump. A couple years ago, the Congress started designing these laws that were tailored. It's like they created a path. And when they first, it was funny because I talked to Anibal a couple years ago. We were sitting around watching these laws being passed. They didn't make any sense. And it was like, they've got a plan. We'll know what they're for. Well, now we do, right? One of them, a specific example, is a cyber crimes. It was originally designed against pedophiles and, and all that dark stuff that happens online. But they added some articles to it where publishing online, what they consider, and it's the definition of fake news, makes you, then you can be charged up to, and I think it carries up to 10 years in prison. So most of these journalists that have been cited by the prosecutor's office in the Violeta Chamorro case, and they've just been, they've been subpoenaed and they go through questioning, and they've been all threatened, like all my colleagues, everybody that's worked for Univision has left the country. Like, we have no representation because all of them went through that, and they sit in the prosecutor's office and they start reading the articles that they've written, for example, for El País, right, which is a known media in Spain. It says here, sources say, what sources? Well, I can't reveal my source. No, that's fake news. I'm going to throw you in jail. So with that threat, it's a matter of, it's at their own discretion, is what they define fake news. So all that is underlying. So he doesn't have, anything in written, or it's the underlying threat that you are at their mercy, and you are completely, because every single entity of justice is in their favor. So you have when you have no recourse, you're at your most vulnerable. And that makes it impossible to work under those circumstances. So then you can only work by crossing the border and being in Costa Rica. But then your family's still back there, your parents, your kids, if you're married. Costa Rica is more expensive than Washington. I paid, $20 from DC airport to my hotel. He paid $40 in Costa Rica from his hotel to San Jose yesterday, the day before. It's ridiculous. So it's really against the rock and a hard place. There's no end in sight here because it's only going to get worse.
Let's go with the next question, with the last question. There we are.
Will do. My name is Mely Hauser, and I run a blog where I translate stories about political prisoners.
Can you? Thank you.
Sorry, it's a habit now with my mask. So my name's Mely Hauser, and I run a blog where I translate stories about political prisoners from Spanish to English. And I was wondering, what's a better way to get these stories out on social media and make them known to the rest of the world. Because I actually know Roland Carino's sister, and she's great. So we've been exchanging ideas back and forth. But I'm definitely looking for better ways to get these stories out there. Thank you.
So I would start saying being here is the best start. And please, I would ask you and all the other ones, ask us every day, every week, every month, how are these guys doing? If they're already free. If they're not free, go on talking about this. Go on investigating about this. That will be my answer. I don't know if somebody else would answer to her. It's okay? Then we have a last question that came in online, and this is how COVID has affected journalists on top of the situation that you already talked about in these countries.
But I have,
Yeah, go ahead.
I have, yes, I cannot.
Take your mask down.
Yes. Okay. I think that, for example, the COVID, we suffer against about how to cover the information, the situation, and some journalists were attacked because they were covering the situation. No? But I think there is a new issue that is emerging, is that the way that the journalists had to work outside from the newsroom, they are not going to the newsroom because they don't have the opportunity to share with us and other colleagues. And the other situation is that, as I explained, that there is some places in Venezuela where you cannot find information about the situation. In the case of COVID, we don't have real information. Huh?
There's no COVID.
COVID.
No COVID.
Yes, in Venezuela, there's no COVID. Even some three of my beloved relative recently passed because the COVID, but they don't have in the numbers, no. So there's no COVID. And other thing that is happening is that the journalists, as a lot of people, the population in the country, they don't have the right to get vaccination in the case that they decide to ask for a vaccination, because there is no a plan of vaccination in Venezuela.
There is like a political punishment with the vaccines.
Yes. So I think that COVID is going to impact everybody in the world, journalists also, and the mental health of journalists is also affected. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that in Nicaragua, COVID is being used as a tool to add repression. Anybody leaving the country needs a COVID test. So the COVID test is centralized. The government is the only one allowed permission to give you a COVID test. It's a PCR. They don't have any antigen or rapid test. So you have to physically go to the health department and you have to show your travel plans. You have to go with your passport. You have to go with your airline ticket or your bus ticket or whatever. So they know 2 days in advance where you're going, what you're doing. By the time you get to the airport, your name's on a list. Many journalists have been not allowed and their passport has been taken away. When you go there, there's the guy on the list. Before you go, looks, okay, check, you can go. The other one, no. I've seen, and many of our colleagues have, their passport has been detained and they're basically under country arrest because they can't leave the country. And coming in is the same thing. Airlines are required, the airlines traveling to Nicaragua are required to submit the list of passenger list with passport number 2 days prior. So by the time you board, there's many instances, people that are not liked, they're not allowed to board. This has been the cases with many journalists, including international journalists that I know of, media, like the Post and New York Times. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, okay.
Specifically, it's the same situation, but specifically in Cuba, the security forces have used the figure of spread of pandemics to repress people that are expressing in the street, going to rallies, or even make some information on some ask to the authorities about the issue of the pandemic strategy. But the figure of spread of pandemic has been used by police forces in Cuba.
Well, I think we close this press conference today here. Thank you so much, Anibal and Tiffany, for coming here. Thank you, Pedro. Armando, Mely, and Carlos. Thank you for the trip. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the National Press Club and the Press Freedom Committee. Thank you to Fundamedios, to Voces del Sur, the Pan American Development Foundation. Thank you, ladies. Race and Equality, Inter-American Press Association, the Inter-American Dialogue, IFEX, PEN America, PEN International, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, also AMARC and CPJ who joined this. Thank you, Raul, for the transmission, and here we close. Thank you so much. To our speakers, Voice of America wants to interview you in Spanish, so be aware of this. And